Hello and welcome to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. I'm your host, and today here in studio we have Karl Ulrich with Sebaly, Shillito and Dyer and Pandy Pridemore from the Human Resource USA, here to talk to us about mistakes that HR make. Now, does the HR department ever make mistakes? Really?
Never.
Never?
Why are we doing this show? Why are we doing? And you know what's crazy is it's becoming more and more common for companies not to have HR departments.
They just figure like they'll just wing it?
They have individuals who claim the role or fulfill the role, but we're seeing a decline in HR departments unless you're a huge major corporation.
Really?
So mistakes are becoming very, very common. And Karl and I did a show with you here a while back on common mistakes. Mm-hmm. So what we thought we'd do today is twist that a little bit and talk about the mistakes that occur when there isn't proper training. The kind of things that are totally and completely preventable, but unfortunately cause huge issues when not addressed.
Now, when you say training, are you talking about training of the HR personnel, or are you talking about the employees?
Well, I think you're talking mainly, first and foremost, about training of the supervisors. You know, the supervisors are the ones who have that sort of day-to-day contact with the workers. They're the ones who are the first person that the workers will go to when they have questions. They'll be the first person that the supervisors, the first person those employees will go to when they have a question about a rule. And the supervisors are usually the ones that are applying the rules in the first instance. And so it's really important that those first-line supervisors understand what the rules are and that they use the HR team, professionals, in the right way, as a resource, as a guide, as a support mechanism, so that when they're doing their work, they're doing it right.
Well, doing it right, like to the point of taking complaints seriously from an employee that comes to them, that to not blow that complaint off, or think it's not that important.
And I like the way you started that, because let's think about this. When a supervisor receives information from an employee, how are they processing that information? Are they taking that as a complaint? Are they taking that as a recommendation? Are they taking that as a suggestion? Are they taking it as a request for an accommodation? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the sad part, is if our supervisors aren't trained on how to receive that information, they don't know what category to put it in. They don't know who to partner with. And one of the biggest issues that you're currently dealing with is there retaliation associated with communication when an individual comes and has a conversation with the supervisor and it's not processed correctly.
Yeah.
I mean,
they take it personal, as some sort of a personal attack, if it's something that maybe they're personally doing.
That's a possibility, but what if it's just a topic they don't want to deal with?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of times the supervisors are focused on one thing and one thing only. It's getting the product out the door, or finalizing the service for the customer, or whatever it is their particular business is. And so they're focused on that, and too often the human resources problem gets shoved aside, and so the supervisor refocuses on the things that are important to them. The problem with that, though, is that a issue that's pushed aside then begins to grow and become a bigger problem without being addressed. And I think the supervisors have to be prepared to identify those issues early, be prepared to, they have to understand how to use the HR function. They have to understand how to go to an HR person, when to go to an HR person, how to identify the issue, when to go to the HR person, and then what to do to work with that HR person to resolve the problem. This is a system, it's a process, and it's really in addition to the work that they're doing on a daily basis to get the product out the door. That's part of that's part of what supervisors really need to, effective supervisors really need to be able to do nowadays.
So do they get, so does an employer go someplace specific to get the training? Do they put the HR people through a training program, and then do they also put the employees, through a process of understanding the process of how we air grievances and how we approach issues?
Well, I think training starts in-house. There are a lot of great resources, outside resources, but I think the place to start with supervisor training is with your own policies and procedures, your own handbook.
Right.
You sit down with those supervisors and make sure they've read it, for one thing. They know what rules they're enforcing. Right?
That's a rule?
Right, that's a rule. I didn't know that was, I didn't know we had an attendance
deviate
policy.
from it.
Right?
If it's in writing, you don't deviate.
Yeah.
And make sure that they're all on the same page. You don't have one supervisor applying a rule in one way and
good
another
point.
supervisor applying a rule in another way.
Good
This is
point.
an unfairness question. It's a question of discrimination, of disparate treatment. You get all kinds of, as Pandy knows, all kinds of legal issues that she has to address on a daily basis in her job.
So you have different teams, at an employer, and one team leader, is lax and lets everybody kind of do what they want to do and smoke or, dip or what, they're spitting in their cups and that's not allowed. And the other team leader is making everyone, hey, you have to wait for a break and you have to go outside and this, those kinds of things. I've seen it at a lot of different employers. Like you said, everybody applying it, equally. The rule's the rule, and of course, then you kind of get the reputation of being, Mr. or Mrs. Rule follower, and you got.
Oh, and
get
that's
people,
just tragic when it's somebody
Yeah.
who's complaining about a safety issue.
Yeah.
So let's kind of list those kind of things. What kind of communication could the supervisor be getting that they need to be properly trained for? Obviously, a request for an accommodation if they're an employer with 15 or more employees. And let's go back to bullying. If there's any kind of bullying, one individual cannot interpret bullying as being this type of activity or behavior, and the supervisor across the other side of the manufacturing floor say, oh, no, they're just fooling around.
Yeah.
So that's a piece of information and communication that has to be consistent throughout the company in terms of how they define that.
So this team's allowed to slap each other on the rear end, and
Right.
the other
Well,
way.
let's go with
Well, let's use that as an example.
I
Yeah,
mean,
sexual
I've seen
harassment.
it.
Perfect
Sexual
example,
harassment.
sure.
Yeah. There
Sure.
might still be women out there who have been treated in a certain way that they're kind of pushing off and finding acceptable, and we have very noticeably been told that that's not a good behavior by another group of individuals who have brought it to everyone's attention. So that's the kind of communication that a supervisor absolutely has to partner. And again, if there's no HR department, then you partner with the ownership and you bring somebody in from the outside to help them process through all that and provide training.
Know what what's appropriate touching, walking up behind and massaging and
Who does that? Who does that? We're all laughing.
We're not allowed to do that,
We're
right?
all laughing. Supervisors need to be trained on how to properly interview. How many times do the HR department pass candidates to a supervisor and the door's closed, they don't really know what's going behind there? You have to make sure, and it should be a part of the development plan anyways, if you've got some up and coming team leads or individuals who want to participate in that process, interviewing skills definitely needs to be a part of that training program and can get you into huge issues if you're asking the wrong questions.
Well, I know we've spoken before, referencing someone's age or, their lifestyle or something of that
Even
nature.
if they've had injuries on the job or filed for workers' comp claims, my gosh, all of that. It
When they
seems
ask about
innocent
kids.
enough. It seems relevant. Well, I don't know about kids. That's not
Do you
relevant
plan
to the
on
job.
having kids?
Well, and that's still not relevant to the job. But in some people's mind, absolutely, we got owners that need to be trained for that question. I would even say teaching a supervisor how to practice reasonable suspicion and how to identify a reason to send somebody off and have drug test.
Okay.
You can't go over there and just point at them and say, you're on drugs. It's not going to work that way. And the state of Ohio is a big proponent. They require reasonable suspicion.
Okay.
So are your supervisors, trained to do that?
Yeah.
Another area of training, I think, is documentation. One of the things we always have trouble with is, addressing a problem, a claim that's made, and then pulling up the file and trying to recreate the history.
There's nothing in here.
There's nothing here. There's no documentation, and so I think part of that is on HR, but a lot of that is on the supervisor. The supervisor, again, is that first point of contact with the employee. So they're the ones who are going to be having that first conversation. They're the ones who are going to be first observing the behaviors that might be stepping over the line. They're the ones who might be seeing somebody using their cell phone when they're not supposed to be using a cell phone. So the documentation has to be prepared and created in a way that is most useful for the company, either for corrective action or, in the worst case scenario, in defense of a lawsuit. But that creation of documentation is an art, and it needs to be practiced and it needs to be taught.
So if a supervisor just verbally kind of corrects an employee, should they put that in writing in their file, somewhere? I mean, because maybe at the moment they're just thinking, well, I told him about that. I alerted him to that behavior and that's not acceptable. Yeah. But if you don't put that in writing, they don't know that, you've done that 4 times.
Right.
And
right.
It's not, now we're to the point where now I need to actually do like a written reprimand of some sort.
Well, I mean, some verbal, every supervisor on a daily basis communicates with their employees, helps them, answers questions, and not every single communication can be documented. Right. They wouldn't have any time to do anything else. But so there is some training about, when does something rise to the level of an issue that needs to be put on paper, and that is part of the training process for all supervisors. But it's not even just about identifying. It's about what do you write down, what do you not write down? How quickly do you have to put this stuff on paper? Can you wait to do it for a week? That kind of stuff. And where does this information go once it's created? Do they stuff it in a filing cabinet in their office, or does it go someplace else, like
Good point.
Clue, HR, the dot connector, that one office where all, that institutional memory has to be created. That's where the HR function steps up and becomes that memory bank for the company. And so learning to use the HR function that way is again part of the documentation process.
Ever had any nightmare situations, Pandy? When you open the file?
How much time?
Not having a file? That's my nightmare. That's my nightmare, is going and saying, what do you mean, you don't have a personnel file? What do you mean you don't have a personnel file?
It's right up here.
That's right.
You think I'm joking. You think I'm joking. Very quickly, I also want to list that, understanding proper pay practices, and I'm not talking about assigning people hourly rates. I'm talking about just, understanding if you have non-exempt employees, you have to pay them for every hour worked. That means understanding what's after hours, understanding what's off the clock, understanding when you can deduct a break of nothing less than 20 minutes under the Fair Labor Standard Act. I mean, I've got supervisors that still tell people to clock out for their smoke breaks, even, or going to the, 15-minute break time. You got to train them and take control of that. But also, I still get supervisors who are changing time cards, and he couldn't have stayed there, and they take overtime off, or they deduct and change, and that is so wrong. There are ways of doing that, but you have to follow the Department of Labor's standards for that.
Is there a way to document that, where the employee actually says, hey, I forgot to clock out?
Absolutely. So that's stuff that absolutely has to be followed to the rule. And again, if individuals aren't properly trained, if there's no formal HR person there, plausible deniability doesn't work. It doesn't work. Wage and Hour loves to jump on all those kind of things. So let's very quickly just kind of wrap up what all supervisors need to be trained on. Okay. So I started out with retaliation. I went to sexual harassment, bullying.
I think just a general overview of the policies and procedures, the attendance policy, the appropriate behavior in the workplace policies, all the rules that are in that handbook, those supervisors need to be aware of them, because they are the enforcers to some degree, the first enforcers for all those rules. So that's where I start. But beyond that, Pandy made a good point. I mean, just some of the general rules on wage and hour, some of the general rules on how does the FMLA work, for example. Supervisors get caught up in this all the time, where they'll have conversations with employees that put them on notice of a potential FMLA issue, leave issue, and they have to respond to that. And if they don't know what they're looking for, they don't give the appropriate response. So those are some other things.
Or the documentation associated with requesting an accommodation or FMLA. I mean, whether it's granted or whether it's warranted, there's still paperwork that goes along with it. So that's definite. Understanding, again, how to hear for a request for an accommodation. Again, reasonable suspicion, excuse me. How to, send somebody off for a random drug test. That's very, very important in my mind. Safety issues. Right. And I think the number one thing that all companies need to be aware of is if you don't have a properly trained HR person, I think that's, you started me out with that, but I want to wrap it up with that.
Okay.
I cannot tell you how many times I walk in to work with a client and she says, oh, I'm HR. Where did you get properly trained? Well, and if she was properly trained, it was 10 years ago, and
I've
the
been here
company's
20
not
years. That's what makes me properly
Yes,
trained.
and she hasn't kept up with that training. She hasn't kept up with the nuances that are changing all the time. And that's just a huge flag for me.
Yeah.
You need to give, if you do have somebody fulfilling that role, give them the resources, whether it's somebody like Karl or myself, or get them to classes so that they can stay up on how to keep all this compliant.
Laws continue to change, Karl, Pandy,
time.
don't they? And so, having maybe a continuing ed type of
Yes.
class, once a year, maybe at least every other year, something would probably be in order.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to us about, I'm sure we only scratched the surface on all the potential mistakes that HR could make, but great information. Thank you for being here. You've been watching Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. Until next time, we'll see you right here on Business Talk.
I like that. I like it.